Alright folks, welcome to the wireless class. Alright, we're going to talk about chapters 1 and 2. Alright, make sure you understand the difference between wired and wireless networks. It might sound easy, well, wired needs a wire and wireless needs no wires, so it's easy. But that's not what I'm talking about. It's more like even with the N protocol that we have that's pretty popular today. My typical home network is wired at 100 megabits per second, and with the N protocol, wireless access router, I have 100 megabits per second theoretically through the air. But they're actually, the model or the architecture is very different. Like here in the wired network, every PC plugs into a switch on its own separate cable. So every PC can talk on the network at the same time. And they all have their own unique paths. The only time a PC can't talk on the network is when some other traffic is coming into his NIC card at the same time he's trying to broadcast out, in which case you have a collision. But other than collisions, every PC gets their full wired speed anytime they want it. Now, if we fast forward to wireless networks, totally different. Before we even get to the wire, every wireless device in that area has to connect to one wireless access point. So if you're in McDonald's or Starbucks and they have one wireless access point and there are 5 people there with laptops and their phones are set to auto connect, to whatever available wireless is there, and those phones connect, then you've got 10 devices all sharing the wireless router. And the wireless is like a timeshare. Only one person can talk at a time. So if I'm a wireless client and I want to speak on the wireless network, I'll send a request to send. And then the wireless router decides who can send first and sends them a clear to send and lets them send for a certain amount of time. And then he kind of time shares to the next guy, the next guy, the next guy. But only one wireless device communicates at a time. So back to the example, even if I have the N protocol wireless access router in my Starbucks, and I have 10 devices that all have, wireless N protocol, and they're all at 100 megabits per second, and they all want to communicate at the same time, they're all going to share the bandwidth, so they're only going to get 10 megabits per second each. So at home, it's obviously pretty easy to set up. We just put in a wireless access point or a wireless router, and we typically only have a few devices. But in businesses, you'll typically have spots where there's going to be 10, 15, maybe even 20 wireless devices. And you can't just pop in one wireless access point. So the whole architecture, the design model is totally different for wireless than it is for wired networks. And then there are other factors that come into play as well. On a wired network, every NIC card has been 100 megabits per second since the early 2000s, maybe even the end of the 90s. So there really isn't no big difference. You're either 100 speed or 1000 speed, but the communication and the signaling, everything's always the same because we've had Ethernet for 20, 30 years. But wireless is totally different. Early on we had the B protocol, then the G protocol, then the N protocol. And things like the Roku box that are popular for houses, those ship with the G protocol. But if you have an N protocol wireless router and it has to do downgrade itself to the G radio and use the G radio to connect, then you're still at G speeds and you're still at G distances, things like that. So you have to be careful with what's in the clients. All the clients need to be on the most advanced technology, the N protocol or AC. So there are a lot of factors at play, because I typically get people that ask me, like around the neighborhood, oh, my Roku box doesn't connect, or my iPad doesn't connect very well, and I'm like, well, how many devices do you have? And between, they've got a computer upstairs that's on the wireless, then little Billy's using it for networking or doing something for school. They got 2 people on Roku devices, and then they have phones that automatically connect. And your phone, when your phone connects to, your home Wi-Fi, think of all the apps that are running. There are tons of things that are checking. Do you have any mail? Do you have any text messages? Things like that. So even though you're not doing anything on your phone is still kind of sending traffic here and there, which obviously takes up time. So a lot of different factors in wireless that are not a problem in wired networks. So keep that in mind. All right, let's get into some technical terms. Modulation is the addition of data to a carrier signal. The wireless signal actually has 2 parts. It has the carrier signal, the waveform that kind of like goes out and kind of spreads and goes into the pattern or the range. and then it has the data that's added on to that. Now, it's a very obviously technical process, and we don't need to get into that. Just to make sure that you understand the difference. All right, and then we talk about a couple different things like amplitude. Amplitude really is the strength of the signal. You know, when we see wave patterns, the higher the wave, the more amplitude it has. And I like to think of that as the size of the rock that you throw into the water. You know, if I throw in a small rock, you know, I get small ripples, and the ripples will die out faster. But if I throw in a cinder block and drop it from a bridge overhead into a lake, you know, it's going to generate bigger waves. So that's more amplitude. So I'd like to think of amplitude as the size of the rock that you throw into the water. The bigger the rock, the bigger the waves, and the farther out they go. All right, and then phase. Phase is the space between signals, or the space between waves. You know, if I've got two peaks, well, if I got several peaks, and the space between, you know, one signal and another signal is, you know, 0.3 on at one peak, and it's 0.4 another one, then obviously I'm out of phase. And your book has a couple pictures that kind of will make that sound a little bit better. But phase is the space between waves, or the amount of space between signals, something like that. All right, then frequency. Frequency is measured by the amount of cycles per second. So if I look at this, so here I see, you know, the signal, or the wavelength, starts at 0, goes positive, then goes negative, and then comes back to 0. So this is one cycle here. So there's one cycle, 2 cycles in a second, so it would be 2 hertz. So a hertz is a measure of frequency, and it's how many cycles per second. If I'm at 3 hertz, then I'm at 3 cycles per second. So make sure you know that when you'll probably see that on a test or a quiz or an exam. All right, now here's a little bit helpful info. So here, amplitude, obviously the measure of strength. The taller the waveform, the more amplitude it has. And then phase, remember phase is the distance between two different points, two top of the waves. So here, this one is in phase, because you can see that the distance here is the same as the distance here. So in this diagram, it's said to be in phase. But if I look at this diagram in here, I got this point, and then I have this point, nothing, this point, this point. So this one's really kind of out of phase because they don't all match. So that's phase, the distance between the peaks, or the distance between the signals. All right, and then how many waves I have per second is the frequency. So I hope that kind of clears that up for you. All right, in the United States, they have 3 bands that are clear for wireless LANs, 900 megahertz, 2.4 gigahertz, and the 5.0 gigahertz. Way back when the very first portable cell phones, not portable cell phones, but cordless phones came out, they were all 900 megahertz. And because everybody's phone was 900 megahertz, if you were close enough with your phone to your neighbor's house when they got a call, you could actually hear the call and do other weird stuff. But we don't really use that anymore. Nowadays, we're all using 2.4 or 5.0. Now, the older G protocol, it uses 2.4 only. But the newer N and AC protocols can use 2.4 or 5.0. The better ones will have dual radios that can do both. All right, in the 2.4 range, in the United States, we only have 11 channels that we're allowed to use. Now, in the UK and some other places, they're allowed to use all 14 channels, but in the United States, they only let us use the first 11 channels. So when you set up a wireless access point here in the US, you'll only see 11 channels show up. Of those 11 channels, only 3 do not overlap. And the reason they overlap is because there's 22 megahertz spread on each channel. So if I'm on channel 1 and you're on channel 2 you can see here is the green line. You can see that there's a lot of overlap. So if your access point is set to 1 and mine is set to 2, we would both see each other, and then it could cause interference. Like I could switch between both of those kind of back and forth. You know, here's one piece goes to you, one piece goes to me. So now I'm time sharing on 2 different access points. So it's not good. So if you're going to do multiple access points, you want to split them up on non-overlapping channels 1, 6, and 11. And the big reason for that is you don't want to be sharing data across 2 wireless access points, because now I'm time sharing with 2 different devices. And if I'm doing anything with UDP, which obviously doesn't do error correction and plays them in the order they're found, you know, one wireless access point may be sending data to the source faster than the other access point. So let's say theoretically I'm here between 1 and 2, every packet I send to the one wireless access point is going slower than to the two, so now my YouTube video is playing all kinds of weird stuff. So we want 1, 6, and 11, and that way as I'm walking here across and I go between access points, you can see that there's kind of a clear space, but obviously if this carried down, I would hit. But then eventually I'm going to switch over to 6, or if I move back over here, I'm going to be on 1. So I'm going to be on one wireless access point for all my communication unless I move all the way over into another area. And that assures proper roaming. Now eventually we'll talk about roaming a lot more in detail, but for right now, 1, 6, and 11. Most home access home routers and stuff, especially with the older G stuff, all shipped on channel 1. So the very first thing you wanted to do was either switch to channel 6 or 11, especially if you're in an apartment building, because everybody in that apartment building was going to be on channel 1, and you don't want to share the same channel. So if you're having issues with interference or low speed or things like that, and you're in like an apartment building or somewhere else where there's other wireless access points, switch to a different channel, 1, 6, or 11. If you're on 1, go to 11. If you're on 11, go to 1, and see if that helps. And if you look on your book on page 11, near the bottom, it shows you that even the 5 gigahertz band has been split up into 4 separate bands inside there. Although I'm not going to test you on those bands. But it's just interesting to know that even the 5 gigahertz range has been split up. Alright, moving on. The decibel. Alright, usually decibel is used to measure sound, but they also use it to measure the wireless signal. Because it's kind of, sound and wireless are really kind of the same thing. It's both a wave that kind of carries. Alright, so it's abbreviated as lowercase d, uppercase b. And the dB is a function that uses a logarithm to compare absolute measurements to each other. So when we use it in wireless, it's just a way of us to compare two different antennas to see how they measure up against each other. So what they did was that they came up with 2 different measurements. There's dBi and dBd. So dBi is a theoretical isotropic antenna where the data, or I'm sorry, the signal and the power all comes from the middle and radiates outward infinitely. And so one measure, the measure of dBi, is based on that. So here's this theoretical measurement, and then they compare your antenna to what they think this theoretical thing would be. And then there's also the dipole antenna. Now that's the little crappy antennas that you get on the little blue Linksys home access points. So dBd is is a more realistic measure. But sometimes when you see antennas out there, their gain, which is their signal strength, is either measured in dBi or dBd. So just make sure you understand that dBi is a theoretical reference point and dBd is more of an actual reference point. To convert the two, I believe you have to add 2 to the dBd. But let me check that real quick. Alright, in dBd versus dBi, if your gain is in dBi, you take the gain in dBd and you add 2.15. We used to always just add 2.2, but you can add 2.15 if you want to be specific. And that converts the dBd to a dBi setting. So again, that way, if you're looking at 2 antennas, I have one antenna that's a 4 dBi, and then I have one antenna that's a 6 in dBd. The dBd obviously would be stronger because with the dBi I need to subtract 2.5, and if I'm going from dBi to dBd I need to add 2.5. So again, I'm looking right here. If I want the gain in dBd, I take the dBi and I minus 2.5 or 2.15 or 2.2. And if I want to make the gain, if I want to compare it to a dBi, I take the dBd and add. So I don't know if I can funk that up for you any harder, but that's what it is. Now, in today's world, I think almost all the antennas have like a dBi rating. I don't think you see a whole lot of dBd anymore. But just in case if you ever see that. That used to be a test question on the wireless exam, but now I think that they're more about the 3 laws of dB. According to your book, they have 3 laws: the law of 0, the law of 3, and the law of 10. Or the rule of 0, the rule of 10, the rule of 3. And if the dB means 0, it means that both are the same. It means the isotropic radar, the reference value, and the antenna that you're looking at are both the same. So a dB of 0 means that you're identical to the reference, the standard. And then a dB of 3 means you have double the power of the reference. And a dB of 10 means you have 10 times the power of the reference. So remember, with dBi and dBd, there's a reference point, and the reference point is either a theoretical isotropic antenna or it's a dipole antenna. So if I have a DBD of 0, then I have the exact same power level as a reference dipole antenna. Now the reference antennas are obviously pretty weak because they were from years ago. So you never want to see a gain of 0. And most of the time you won't. You'll see gains of 3, 5, 9, kind of stuff like that. So make sure you understand it. And if you don't, ask in class. Again, I'm much better face-to-face than I am in a video. Alright, so what do antennas look like, or what do you see when you see them? Let me show you. Alright, if you just pop in Cisco antenna and Google it, it's the very first one, cisco.com, the reference guide. And it kind of goes through all the different stuff like that your book goes through, the different frequencies, the modulation techniques, the FHSS, the DSSS, that we'll talk about in a minute, the types of antennas, omnidirectional or a Yagi, which is a directional antenna. Again, you see this measure, the 1 dB, 3 dB, that kind of stuff. So remember, 0, that's the reference speed, which again is very slow. They talk about the Fresnel zone. And where do we get to antennas? The different channels. Oh, so here you can see they're all measured in dBi. So the gain, remember, gain is the strength of the antenna, and typically nowadays they're all measured in dBi. So this is 3.5, so it's a little bit more than double the speed or the power of the reference antenna. And 6, 9, 5, 7. So you get the idea. There was one that actually showed you the pictures of the antennas, and then kind of showed you their signal patterns and things like that. Yeah, there we go. So like here you have a dipole, and then this is from above. I'm sorry, this one here is from above. So this is looking at it from over top of it, and this is looking at it from sideways. So you can see sideways, it's more almost like a donut. There's like a spot in here exactly where the antenna is, where the signal is not very strong, because the signal has to get a little bit away from the antenna before it can form fully, and that's why you have that kind of divot thing here. You can't really see it from above because the above is just showing the outline of it, from above. But looking at it from the side, you can kind of see it's more like a donut. Same thing. And now we get into some more directional antennas where it's here and it's kind of going out this way. So again, this is above and this is looking at it from the side. So again, you can kind of like find the signal or the pattern that matches, what you're trying to look for. Am I trying to go down a hall? Am I trying to cover several rooms? That kind of stuff. So that's what you'll see. And again, almost all antennas nowadays are rated in dBi. All right, moving on. So, all right, EIRP. Effective isotropic radiated power. And this is on page 21. This is your measurement for power, or really kind of for gain on an antenna. And there are government regulations that say exactly how much power you can use in most antennas. Obviously depending on their use. Now, the book walks you through the formula for figuring this out. Again, you don't have to do any formulas in this class. There is no math in this class. It's just, basic wireless knowledge. And obviously, you can't change the EIRP. Obviously, if you jack up your antenna, then, the FCC can fine you, things like that. So that's probably the last thing you want to do. However, you can do some things. Like there was a student a couple of semesters ago. He took one of the blue wireless access points, the blue Linksys, and he cracked the top off and he put a different operating system on there. He stripped off the ROM that was on there and flashed it with either Tomato or WRT22, whatever that is. So he flashed, I think it was the WRT one. Anyway, so with that, he was actually able to slowly turn up the power, and he had to put a fan over the processor chip. So we took like a computer fan and mounted that on a heatsink and put it on top of the processor. So he was actually pushing more power into that to get more power through the antennas, and it actually increased his range and stuff. So it was kind of neat. But again, it's also highly illegal. If the FCC were to find out, although I don't know how they would, you could get fined. All right, so modulation. Remember, modulation is adding data to the carrier signal, and there are 3 different ways to do this. FHSS was the very early wireless, and we don't use it anymore. So really, there are only 2 forms that we use nowadays. We use DSSS and OFDM. Now, I'm not going to explain them both because I'll flunk it up. It's better if you just read the book. But DSSS is for low-speed signals, 11 megabits per second and lower. And then once we pass 11 megabits and we get to 12 megabits or higher, we typically use OFDM. Now there are two, I think 6 and 9 megabits per second that also switch over to OFDM. But just for, as far as we're concerned in this class, from 0 to 11 megabits per second, we're going to use DSSS. And then from 11 or 12 megabits per second on up to 54 megabits per second or higher, we're going to use OFDM. And this is all totally automatic. And again, it's based, once you read these, on the technology themselves. Each technology has a certain cycle speed. And that's why DSSS can only go up to 11 megabits per second, because after that you've kind of exceeded the speed. And OFDM, I think, is at 22 or something. So when you half it, you're at 12, or really 11. So that's kind of like where it starts, at half speed. All right. So again, your speed for wireless actually has tiers or steps. If I'm at 54 megabits per second and I slowly start walking away from the wireless access point, I don't step down to 53 and 52 and 51. I actually, once 54 is unattainable, I go down to the next step, and the next step is 48 megabits per second. And then after 48, I take a big jump down to 36. And that's why I guess people don't understand that. If your Roku's on one side of the house and your wireless access point's on the other side of the house, your Roku may be connecting, but it may only be connecting at 18 megabits per second or something like that. So these are the steps. You can see 1, 2, 5.5, and 11 are all under the DSSS modulation. And then as soon as you hit the step at 12 megabits per second, that's when OFDM starts. So OFDM covers 12, 18, 24, 36, 48, and 54. So this is the kind of information that your customer needs to be, that you need to explain to your customer. So give an example, like we had a customer and he was, everything he had I think was G, and we told him we needed to get him an N protocol router, and he was like, but all my stuff is G, I don't want to convert, I don't see the point of getting an N protocol if just because it's backwards compatible, why can't I just get a cheaper G protocol router? And we're explaining to him, hey, with your G protocol, you've stepped down to the 24 megahertz range, and if I get you an N protocol, the stronger antennas there will actually bump you up 2 tiers to the 48 megabit tier, and then you'll be really doubling your wireless speed. So that's kind of the stuff that you have to explain to the customer. All right, so there are 4 major wireless technologies. Really, there are only 2 that are actually in existence now. Years ago, I want to say that in the year 2000, I think that 802.11a came out, and then right after that was 802.11b. So 802.11a came out, and it had great speed, 54 megabits per second. So think back, 16, 17 years ago, we had 802.11a that had 54 megabits per second. The problem was the range was terrible. As soon as you got like 30 feet away, you started dropping really fast. So then they also came out with 802.11b, which was only 11 megabits per second, but had better range. So I need to fix that, because that should say good range and small, or poor range and good range. So A had terrible range, good speed. B had slow speed but great range. Now, everybody adopted B because back then, in the early end of the 90s and beginning of the 2000s, most of the buildings were still wired with Category 3 cable, and we still had 10 megabit connection NIC cards. So getting 11 megabit wireless was kind of the same. So most businesses way back in the early implementations were all 802.11b. And then I think in 2003, 802.11g came out, and that was like the best of both worlds. It was the speed of A and almost the range of B. So 54 megabits per second and good range, and then everybody converted to G. So at this point in time, you're not going to see any A's or B's out there. It's all G or above. All right, then a couple years ago, N came out. Now you'll see a bunch of different speeds listed for N. I've seen it even listed at 1,000 megabits per second on one box somewhere. But we typically just say it's 100 megabits per second. But you get an increased range because the N protocol routers don't have the stupid dipole antennas hanging out. They actually have powered antennas internally that do way better than the little cheapy dipole antennas. So you get way more range with an N protocol. Now obviously today the AC protocol is out there and it's been ratified and stuff like that. But truthfully, if you really dig into N versus AC, you'll find that you're probably a lot better off with just the N protocol, because the AC has got some weird limitations and stuff that we'll talk about when we get to that section. All right, and that's it. All right, just make sure that you read both chapters 1 and 2 And remember, don't worry about the math. We don't do the math here at Stark State. If you took this class over at Akron U, you would be doing all the math. And it's part of their testing and stuff like that. But again, in the real world, we all use calculators out there for this stuff. And it's already out there for us. You know, you can kind of figure out, hey, this is the bandwidth, this is the gain that I need. I need to go through these walls. And there's a bunch of, you can just take a wireless access point and place it down and then test it on the other side of the wall. So there's no need to do all this crazy math stuff that some of these people do. But I digress. So make sure you read both chapters and you're ready for the lab when you come in. And I think that's it. All right, folks, have a good one.